Welcome back to the SOPA Awards 2020. I'm Angie Lau, Editor-in-Chief of Forecast News. It is my pleasure to sit down right now with Gerry Shih. He is the China correspondent for the Washington Post for this very intimate and candid fireside chat. Gerry, it's good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Angie.
Journalism, what's happening right now?
Oh my God, you tell me.
March 2020 of this year. You were situated in Beijing, and suddenly, was it a knock on the door or did you get a call? How were you alerted that Beijing authorities wanted to talk with you?
Well, actually, I was at home with my partner, as many people were at that time, because not many things were open out in the streets of Beijing. And I think we were just having one of those low-key nights watching Netflix, and suddenly I get a ring on my phone. It was one of my colleagues in the Beijing bureau, and she said, "Hey, does this announcement affect you?" And it was an announcement from the foreign ministry that basically they would be canceling the visas for American journalists. So the next couple of days were just an absolute whirlwind. Packing our stuff, figuring out what stays and what goes, where I would go, and so we were given a fair bit of time by the Chinese government. In the end, there were about a dozen of us from the 3 American newspapers who left. So we had about 10 days, 2 weeks to pack our bags. I ended up in Seoul for about 3 months, and here I am in Taipei.
Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Washington Post. Was this? What was your reaction? I mean, obviously this was still just in the middle of your tenure as China correspondent in Beijing. The kind of stories that you were doing meant something not only to you, obviously, or the publication, but to a global audience. And to be suddenly just kind of jerked like that, what must that have felt like?
I think it was, it feels very surreal to kind of tell that the life that you've had and the work that you've been doing for all these years, has to suddenly come to an end. At the same time, and this is probably the most worrying part, is that in some ways the writing was kind of on the wall. And in the weeks since, we've seen not only journalists being thrown out from both countries, but consulates now being closed in Houston and in Chengdu, and we just sort of seem to be locked in this spiral of worsening relations. And when you look at it from that perspective, basically these diplomats and these journalists are all sort of pawns, I guess, in this bigger struggle. And so, in many ways, I still to this day don't believe that this was personally directed at me.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's convenient for some in the Chinese government that there is less scrutiny from international press and reporters, but at the same time, I let's put it in the context of this greater conflict between the two countries.
It's a proxy. It really feels like that. It's a proxy war, and a lot of people and professions, specifically journalism, really being dragged into this tit for tat. Where do you think that puts us? By us, I mean the collective profession of people, scribes and broadcasters, who are simply telling the stories of the human condition.
Yeah, I think, ultimately, I think it's short-sighted behavior and policies from both governments. I think that, yes, do journalists, as you say, sort of speak truth to power and, often publish and broadcast stories that are highly critical of the Chinese government and that they find politically inconvenient? Absolutely. But I think they would also be the first ones to also acknowledge that we serve a vital purpose. In many ways, often the Chinese government will invite foreign media to their events, on trips to showcase what they would like the world to see. We very much serve as kind of a medium between the world and a country that in many ways remains very inaccessible to the broader world. On another level, having foreign journalists in China, even to this day, or at least until the point when I was in the country, despite the sort of the political acrimony, I would always find, usually, not always, but I would often find the doors of many sort of scholars and even sort of government-linked think tanks open to us. They, especially as relations worsened and the conflict got worse with the US, they actually wanted more interaction with us. They wanted to know the thinking of the decision makers in Washington. They wanted to know how the outside world was looking at China. And I think there is that kind of hunger among the policymaking community for, okay, we can have the sort of the theater of conflict, but there is that basic desire to have interaction, to have the understanding that you only get from having people like journalists sort of serve as that medium in Beijing. And then of course there's all the untold stories of just the common people. I think I remember a story that I was covering. It was an explosion in eastern China last year in the spring. And I was, it was obviously embarrassing for the local government. And so there were sort of, plainclothes police who were just swarming this village.
And they were tracking you?
They were tracking me, yeah. And so I was kind of hiding and talking to a group of locals inside of a home, and got to the point where they said, "Oh, okay, so you said that you're working for an American newspaper, right?" And then one woman said, "Oh, well, this guy, he's obviously out to smear us, and he's going to tell a bad picture of China. Like we can't talk to this guy." And then somebody else in the circle said, "Hey, listen, you think that the local state newspaper is going to cover our story? You think, Xinhua is going to cover our story? Like if this guy doesn't tell our story, how's our story going to get out? How are national leaders going to know about our situation?" And they kind of almost sort of said, "Oh, well, the mood suddenly changed. And everybody said, "Oh, okay, please, write your story, let the world, let our national leaders know what the real situation here is on the ground." So I think, from the highest levels of the government to kind of, scholars and experts down to the everyday people who want their stories told, I think there's tremendous benefit for China to have the foreign media there. And so I think it's a real shame, that we are where we are today.
I think it's so moving that, in a real life situation where it matters to get the story told, only then that the villagers really kind of overcame their own suspicion, right? And made that judgment for themselves, opened the doors, opened their homes, and shared their stories with you. Increasingly, that is happening less and less. And I'm not just talking about China. I'm talking about just this general mood of perception of journalists in America, around the world, and just this kind of deepening suspicion amongst the audience and the readership that journalists are biased, the liberal elite. I mean, we've heard all of it, fake news. This, once upon a time, was not even in the vernacular. And here we are decades later, and we're in the thick of it. How did we get here?
It's certainly one of the most disturbing trends that we see in the world. You're absolutely right. When you go to a campaign rally in the United States, the sort of the seething hostility that you would see directed towards the press, closer to home here in Asia for many of SOPA's members. I think you've seen in the Philippines, the kind of the pressure that's been exerted on Maria Ressa and the Rappler. In India, the kind of the political pressures that the ruling party has put on reporters who write critical coverage. And most recently also in Hong Kong, we're seeing just incredible changes, in just the span of a couple of weeks. And so, I think we sort of live in an era where there are so many voices, partly as a result of, I guess, the rise of social media. And we have seen, I guess, kind of a move towards the extremes, sort of, more increasingly tribal politics.
And tribal journalism.
And tribal journalism as well, which certainly doesn't help. And so that center is no longer holding of authoritative voices that are universally respected.
But is that a facade in and of itself? I mean, if you take a look at the diversity of newsrooms, and I'm not talking about skin color or religion or gender, I'm also talking about the socioeconomic, education-based diversity. We all hang out together.
Yes.
We all speak the same language, we all socialize together, we share very similar socioeconomic experiences. Has that helped or hindered this profession?
I think you're right. I mean, there is a very kind of widespread criticism of, I guess, the mainstream media as sort of dominated by middle, upper class, sort of highly educated, coastal, elite, sort of influences, which certainly shapes, I think, the outlook of most newsrooms. It tends to often have a quote unquote liberal slant, and I think those are all absolutely valid criticisms of the sort of our media institutions, at least in the United States. At the same and I think a greater diversity of views, of backgrounds in newsrooms is absolutely necessary, not only in terms of ethnic backgrounds, but as you say, also of socioeconomic backgrounds, and just immigrant voices or working class voices, especially. I think there's a severe shortage, but I think that diversity of viewpoints does not mean a departure from the basic acceptance of facts. And I think that we sort of are in this hyper-polarized media environment, not just in the US, here in Asia, and all of the countries that SOPA members cover. I think there is increasingly this departure from facts, and when you don't have this sort of common ground to have a debate on, and the corrosive effect of social media and sort of fake news and the trolls and the bots, you just kind of wonder how can sort of public discourse, public debates, all the things that need to happen in a healthy society, how that can be sustained.
Marshall McLuhan once said, "The medium is the message." And I think that in this technology-based age of ours, where media is really defined by the platforms, and in this scenario has become the message. That message has many voices, but it is almost clouding and flooding, dare I say polluting, the fact from fiction.
Yeah, and I think the technological upheaval that we've seen in the last 15 years has definitely been a part of that. I personally was very optimistic about the internet 15 years ago. I think that I and many people around the world have started to see sort of the limits and the downsides of just a completely unfettered internet. And I don't mean that the government should step in and censor and referee what can and cannot be said. I also feel very obviously, letting the platforms themselves have that power is also very kind of, problematic. But I think there's a widespread recognition that, in terms of just the unreliability of the information, how fast, a straight up lie can sort of be spread around the world through social media. Yeah. Organized, large scale, sometimes, in many cases, state-sponsored efforts to sow doubt and misinformation. I mean, something needs to change, something needs to give. As journalists, we can do everything in our power to correct the record. But I do worry that, they say sort of, a lie can make its way halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on, right? So, it's how do you fight against, those trends, particularly in an era, as you say, when so much of the political debate is tribal.
So then what does the future hold? At Forecast News, we cover emerging technologies at the intersection of business, politics, and economy. Nothing could be further from this intersection and this crossroads that we're seeing right now. Blockchain is extraordinarily meaningful and interesting to journalism. It's something that it's part of our thesis.
Yeah. Well, and just every part of society, really. I mean,
exactly.
The potential for it, yeah.
The potential of blockchain. But for journalism specifically, what if we could? The immutability. It could be censorship-proof, record-keeping, that the records originally sourced and authenticated could then have permanence and be that layer in the foundation of truth, of facts. Is the future more hopeful as a result of new technology?
I think, in terms of, for example, there have been discussions about blockchain as a way to sort of keep track of, micropayments that could solve a lot of the kind of the business model questions in journalism, in terms of, having a kind of this immutable ledger for fact keeping. Technology certainly will offer many, many, new possibilities for journalism. At the same time, I think the profession, will always remain constant in terms of how it's done and the ideals that it pursues in terms of, I think, being an arbiter for the truth. And at the end of the day, the biggest currency that news organizations will have, I think, is its credibility. And that's something that's intangible and is very difficult to accrue and very easy to sort of throw away. And so I think that, in terms of, no matter how the news gets disseminated, at the end of the day, if people don't believe that you can always at least strive, if not necessarily accomplish, getting as close to the truth and objective fact as possible, then the news industry will always suffer.
Knowing what you know today, way back when, do you think you would have gotten into journalism?
I think so. I think it's, you probably, grew up, in the era of Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather, and for me as well, it's in the print journalism space. I looked up to writers who kind of belonged to these big institutions that seemed very much infallible. Today we know that's not the case, and that was never the case. And so, I think the industry has just undergone such a huge change that in some ways you do sort of miss the days when kind of journalists can sort of float above the fray a little bit, and the money was flowing, and sort of,
We missed that gravy train.
And you should, and you're not getting into Twitter flame wars, but at the end of the day, I think, look, the job, as I said, the fundamental mission remains the same. How we work. We have so many more resources today, in terms of being able to just access information so easily, the access to big data, to kind of online archives. I mean, you can go on to Google Earth and look at a new military installation somewhere. That's kind of unimaginable 20 years ago. At the same time, there are these problems with social media that I said, and I just want to hammer, on a bit more. I think that today we see journalists rely more on social media, which can be such an incredible source of information. I think it can also shape our ways of thinking. And when we sort of, spend hours and hours a day on Twitter, receiving information from the same echo chamber.
That's right.
I think there's a lot of danger in that, and I think that's something that maybe many journalists, especially ones of the younger generation, myself included, are beginning to recognize.
And so then how do you overcome that, especially as the generations follow? I have a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
He's going on 20.
Yeah.
He's on YouTube, and I sound like an awful mommy right now, but he is more well-versed in technology than I ever could have imagined for myself at that age. This is just the world in which he's growing up in. Increasingly, the significance of social media is just going to be part of his experience. And that certainly is the case for a lot of young journalists today. And so then how do we discern? What do we need to aspire to together? And what do we have to learn to overcome, even generationally, and just with differing experiences, obviously?
Sure. I'm actually relatively optimistic on this. I think that, we've just lived through such an incredibly tumultuous period of change in the industry and in the world over the last 15 years or so. But I think people, especially young people, have very strong sort of self-corrective abilities. There was a lot of concern in the let's say 10 years ago about privacy on social media. As we saw, people, especially a younger generation, are very savvy when it comes to, okay, I have a public persona, but all this stuff is out there, and that might be used against me. And it is my hope, and it is my belief that people, as we come to terms with social media, are also going to be savvy about checking out sources of information. Is this really, does this kind of smell right to you?
That's right. Media literacy is so important.
Exactly.
It's a language not a lot of people have.
Exactly. And I think that, are we going to have the same problems with fake news that we have today in 5 years? It's certainly possible.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to be optimistic. Yeah. I think that, for at least the younger generation, I think there might be something kind of in the back of their head that says, maybe I should get a second source on this. Maybe I should check this out. And hopefully, media institutions, the kind of the trusted brands, can be at the center of that.
I think we challenge authority, and I think this next generation needs to challenge the authority of social media.
Yes, and also the traditional media outlets. I think it's precisely because outlets like the Washington Post had that privileged position for so many years that I think it's good that there are people saying, look, you got that fact wrong, and we're going to call you out for it.
Yeah.
Readers and everybody now on the internet are demanding accountability, and I think that can only be a good thing. Right?
It can only be a good thing. So you got kicked out of Beijing. You could not go to Hong Kong, which I think was a really the beginning of a lot of red flags. And so you ended up in South Korea, but now you're in Taipei. You're in Taiwan. What's next for Gerry Shih?
Well, we sort of have, like other international news organizations, we've sort of been looking around Asia to see, where might be a good landing spot for our journalists, particularly since the situation in Hong Kong has been so volatile. As you might know, the New York Times thought that Seoul would be a good place for many of their staff. Personally, I'm not sure if I'll sort of long-term end up here or in Seoul, but I'll certainly be continuing to cover China for the next year or so at least. As you know, it's a nonstop story, especially in the Asia region. So really anywhere is a good, as good as the next place.
We'll be watching for your byline. Share with us a future headline. Let's see, 12 months in the future.
That I'll write, or
that you will write.
Oh, wow.
Educated guess based on everything that's happening in the region and globally. What is Gerry Shih going to write about?
How about remarkable détente in U.S.-China relations paves way for reporters to return to Beijing. How's that?
I love it.
Yeah?
I love it. I will cover that story, and we can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
Until then, we'll be looking for your bylines in a lot of the important stories coming out of this region.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much, Angie.
Thanks, Gerry.
Yeah.
All right.